Welcome to the Film Situation Podcast.
And I'm so honored to have filmmaker Amos Poe on the Film Situation Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Zeph.
So Amos, I guess tell us a little bit how you first got into film.
I think my first understanding of some sort of film was when I was 13 or 14, actually. 14. And, I mean, I'd seen films since I was a kid, but when Kennedy was assassinated, JFK was assassinated in Dallas in 1963, I remember my parents used to get like Life magazine, Time magazine, Look magazine. And Look magazine had this special edition where they broke down the Zapruder footage into frames. So you could see exactly what happened to Kennedy and which bullet hit him when, and there was like a time element. And it was the first time I realized that film was, a series of stills, and that there was a time element to it. So that if you moved the stills, edited, it moved one still before the other one, it told a different story. I remember sitting in front of that magazine and just for days on end, just looking at it and kind of thinking about it. My father gave me an old camera of his, like an old Leica, and I started taking photographs. And I was really into that in the 60s, photojournalism, especially with the American war in Vietnam and everything, and, civil rights and everything else that was going on. So photojournalism was like big. It was like, I thought the best thing you could ever do in life was to be a photojournalist, to be somewhere where something was happening that was really cool. By 1968, the summer of 68, I'd seen a lot of films, and I was more sort of politically driven, and, I was kind of despairing about what was happening in America at that point, with Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination. It was a lot of assassination.
And then a war that probably felt pointless. And then looking back.
Yeah, no, it was more than pointless. It was evil.
Yeah.
I mean, we were attacking, bombing, killing people, for really no reason other than the military-industrial complex. Anyway, so I left in the United States in 1968 and rented a car in London and drove around Europe taking a lot of pictures, and then ended up visiting my father's family in Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. And I happened to be caught in there the third day I was there, third day, as the Russians invaded it, and I took a lot of photographs.
On the Slovakian side or the Czech side?
The Slovakian side, in Bratislava, right across the bridge from Vienna.
Nice.
Across the Danube. So that was my, photojournalist moment, and I was able to sell these photographs to Time Life as I crossed the border. There was a guy there, and I thought, wow, that's it. And when I came back to the States, and I was living in Buffalo, New York at that point, I couldn't take another still picture. Like, what I'd taken during this invasion was so dramatic that any other thing just didn't make sense to me. And I was looking for something that would make sense. And then I happened to visit a friend who was an engineering student up in Buffalo. And what he would do is he would get two pieces of electronics or something, and he would have two pieces, one to take apart and one to have, in case he couldn't put the thing back together, he had another version of it so he could see how it worked. And what he had on his desk, and his kitchen table actually, was a Super 8 camera.
Wow.
And I went, what the hell is that? He said, it's a Super 8 camera. I go, what does it do? Oh, you can make movies with it. You see, you put a thing in here, a magazine, a film, and you send it to Kodak, and it comes back a few days later, and you make a film. I was like, whoa, all right.
Now, had you grown up watching movies and stuff?
I had, and my movie watching was kind of pretty much, I would say, kind of normal suburban, not really a lot of awareness of film stuff until I was probably like 16, 17, and I started to like, really by 1968, 69, I was really like looking at other films for quality of some sort, or what turned me on, or what flipped me out.
Yeah.
Like where the movie's over and you're just sitting there in the seat and you can't get up. So I drove down from Buffalo to New York. I brought my still cameras to Olden Camera on 32nd and 6th Avenue there. And they, traded these cameras for a Super 8 Nizo Super 8 camera and a projector and a little editor. And I got two boxes of black and white and color cassettes, cartridges for the Super 8. Like, I think there were 48 in each box. So, and I drove back to Buffalo the same day, and I started making films. Most of them were music related, and was sort of like music videos now, what became music videos in the 80s. And I started working at a cinema, a place that showed art films. It was called the Circle Art Cinema, and after a few months of working there, I ended up becoming the programmer there. So now I was able to like read books about film and actually program those films on a movie theater so I could see them while I was reading about them.
Total immersion of cinema.
Immersion. Like, so there was no internet, there was none of that. So like that was the way to get into it was, these, here in New York, there was the Bleecker Street and the Carnegie and the Thalia and the Film Forum and all these theaters that showed double bills of stuff. And, that's how I got into it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Were you into Hitchcock growing up?
Well, Psycho definitely, blew my mind.
Yeah.
When I first saw it in the early 60s or mid-60s.
I can imagine. Seeing it now, I think it really holds up. I can only imagine seeing it on the big screen at the time it came out.
Yeah, and the other one was the Birds.
Yeah. I just recently saw that, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Like months ago. I loved it.
That one was, Psycho was scary from a psychological point of view, I think. But the Birds was even scarier in a way because it was environmental.
Yeah, like it could truly happen. Potentially. Like
these other animals are going to conspire to mess with us.
Yeah.
And it kind of made sense. It was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then obviously, later on I read the Truffaut book.
Hitchcock Truffaut.
Yeah,
it's a great book.
Yeah, and that opened up a lot of doors. And I did definitely appreciate Hitchcock. I was drawn to a lot of areas, really. European, Japanese films, French films, Italian films. I had like these periods almost.
Yeah. That makes sense. Because it seems like your work was inspired by French New Wave kind of sensibility.
Well, I always liked the idea of the historicity of film, the historical context, and the fact that these guys were film critics, and then became filmmakers. They were film watchers and then filmmakers. Kind of spoke to me, and there's a lot of films that are really good, and there's a lot of films that are really bad. But the films that really got to me at that period were films that inspired me, where I would see the film and I would go, I could do that.
Yeah,
I could do that. The thing was at the time was that I had no money to make a movie, nor did I have the education to make it. I didn't have the confidence of going to film school and making a movie. I was a filmmaker. I was making stuff, shooting stuff, editing it, doing all, cutting the negative, whatever, doing the sound, the whole thing.
You were extremely action oriented.
Well, I was extremely existentially needing to make stuff. But I also realized, because I came out of sort of the experimental school of filmmaking, let's say, that our culture is so huge that to make any kind of import in dent in the culture would require something bigger than one person making a little film. So my thing was with the Nouvelle Vague in France was that, they made a movement. There was a few of them, Chabrol and Truffaut and Godard and Auguste Varda and Jacques Demy, and there was a whole group of filmmakers making films in the same city, and there were kind of like two neighborhoods, the right bank, left bank filmmakers. I thought, well, that's what I got to do. It's not just making a movie. I have to invent a whole movement. And the good news was there were so many people living around me in the Lower East Side here that were into film. Like everybody I spoke to was into film. Even the musicians or the painters or the artists or the sculptors. I never had a conversation about painting, sculpture, music. It was all about film. Now, I don't know if it was just because I was obsessed with it or that was the nature of the conversation.
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I think even more so at that time, films were, talked about in an important sort of way.
Yeah.
Even now, like I'll take the train and I'll hear people talking on the Metro North that aren't filmmakers, but they're deeply talking about a film. And now it's,
Yeah, they're talking more about Succession.
Series, yeah, Succession.
Streaming.
Yeah.
It's a slightly different environment and slightly different cultural bent at this point because of pandemic and other things. Cinema, as we knew it back then, doesn't really exist anymore. It's more occasionally, did you see this interesting film from Romania? Or, did you see it on BritBox or
Right, sure. And, that's part of what I'm doing with this podcast is to keep the spirit of that sort of alive and, to talk about films that aren't just the main films, but also films that are off the beaten path that I think people should see. But going back to kind of what you were just talking about and creating a movement, you did do that. And that's why I'm excited to have you on the podcast because you were pivotal and instrumental into being a part of that New York City wave of filmmakers.
Yeah, my thinking was like, because, Unmade Beds, which was my sort of remake of Breathless in a sense, and the beginning of the new wave, whatever, New York thing, was that I was going to reimagine Breathless in the New York setting, but the real key there was that I thought if I could make a feature-length film for like $3,000, then there were like 20 other people in the neighborhood who would go, if he could do it, I can do it, right? Because there was so many even more talented people than I was around. In that moment, you had so many interesting people in the same neighborhood, in the same club, in the same night. It was like totally rich with imagination and energy, right?
Yeah.
So my feeling was, if I could make this picture, then other people would like jump into the fray, and that kind of is what ended up happening, and it evolved in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, there were filmmakers then like Jim Jarmusch and Tom DiCillo and
Eric Mitchell, Sarah Driver, Becky Johnston, Beth and Scott B. There were like literally dozens and dozens and dozens. Vivian Dick. People were coming out of the woodwork. People were actually coming to New York to make films in New York. There was this one Swedish guy who died very young, who made a film called Long Island 4. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he came from Sweden to New York. There were people coming from all over. And there were people here already because New York was a kind of a central place. And I was, so immersed in it myself, it became like a little cocoon.
I think it's important to explain. I mean, many people that will listen to the podcast are familiar with films from the French New Wave and Godard and Truffaut. But for people that don't understand, I always kind of say, for those filmmakers in France, what they did for cinema, I feel like it was like the equivalent of what punk rock was for music.
Yeah, so or equivalent to, like, I always thought Godard and Bob Dylan were equivalents. One in film,
because you were growing up when punk rock exploded, so you have a different frame of reference.
Yeah, frame of reference was like, when Dylan went electric, Godard went to color, that kind of thing. But yeah, I always thought there was an equivalence between those two men, even though Godard was like, I don't know, like 10 years older or something, slightly. But they had a certain kind of imagination and maybe bohemian or some form of artistic integrity that created longevity in their careers, at least. And definitely, like, in terms of inspiration, people like that, Godard or Dylan. I mean, to me, Dylan was like a filmmaker, but he was doing it with music and lyrics. Like he was telling you a story all the time. He was kind of creating a mood. One day I was going down to meet a friend for dinner at this little coffee shop on 2nd Avenue and like 4th Street called Minibon. And I was walking down 2nd Avenue and there was a cinema right on 8th Street or St. Mark's called the St. Mark's Cinema, which was, now it's nothing. And I remember like walking in front of it and they were showing a double bill of the two versions of the film, The Killers. It was an Ernest Hemingway story. And I had not seen either, but I'd read about them when I was reading about film noir. I remember like, oh my God. And I looked into the box office and it said, like the next showing was like, there was one at like 7:35 or something and one at like 9:35. And that was the last two screenings. And I went, oh my God. And I looked in my pocket, it had $5. And I wasn't getting paid till late in the next day. So for the next 24 hours, it was $5. So my thinking was, do I go eat with this $5 or do I go see these two films? Because it was exactly $5 to get in. And I was like, what do I do? What do I do? I'm really hungry, but I want to see these films. I finally decided to go in and see the films.
That's awesome.
I hit $5. I went in to see the film. As soon as I got in the theater, I was like, buyer's remorse. I was like, oh shit, no, now what? I'm starving. And I remember going in, and there was very few people in there, and I got this great seat, like in the middle, like, a little bit towards the back, but
good proximity to the screen.
Good proximity to the screen, and there was like maybe a couple of people over here, a couple of people over there, a couple of people in the front, right? Then this couple comes in, and they're both carrying like a large soda and a large popcorn, and they come to the row in front of me, and they sit right in front of me.
Oh, that's so annoying.
Right in front, not even like a seat over.
Yeah.
And the popcorn smells so good. It's like all buttery, and just as the film is and the trailers are about to start, right? They get into this huge argument. I can't remember what it was about, but it was like intense. And the intensity just increased until the woman just yelled at the guy, cursed at him, and walked out. And he was like, fuck you too. And
he walked out?
He walked out, and they left their popcorn and sodas.
Amazing. That means it was meant to be.
So now they didn't, they weren't coming. They didn't seem to, because the movie started, and they didn't seem to be coming back. So I reached over and I got the popcorn and I got the sodas, and I had 2 sodas, 2 popcorns. I was like, this will keep me until tomorrow afternoon when I get paid.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what I thought. Okay, this is meant to be.
That's heaven for a cinephile. I actually kind of want to also talk about the whole punk rock thing. I was really into punk, but at a later era in the 90s, because I'm slightly younger than you.
Right.
So I got So it was, it was a whole different thing when it started. But, I mean, even when I was into it, going to punk and hardcore shows, it was a really lively thing in New York, and I know there's a lot of people from your generation that are like, no, everything was just like an imitation of that thing.
I don't believe that.
Okay, I'm glad you're saying that because, for me, when I was into it, it was a very real thing, an awesome thing, and it gave me this sort of DIY spirit of doing things. Like that's why I'm even a filmmaker. That's why I'm doing a podcast. Otherwise, I don't think I would have had that sensibility. And I know you made the movie The Blank Generation,
Right.
which is a documentary that featured.
Yeah, it's not exactly a documentary. I think of it more as experimental film. I mean, for me, the way I started was I would listen to on headphones to a new record, and then a song would come up, and a movie would start playing in my head to go with the song, and then I would that's the movie I would make. And the thing was that Super 8 cartridges were about 3 minutes, and most songs were around that. So it was really easy to do because a lot of it was editing in the camera. And some of it was editing and splicing with plastic things. But Blank Generation came out of we meaning Ivan Krall and I. Ivan was a musician who played with Patti Smith and Blondie and Iggy. We would go to shows and we would shoot stuff. It became apparent I worked in film distribution for a little while, and there was a place called New Line Cinema, which was on University Place in 13th, and there was a store down the street called Cinemabilia, and there was a guy working there named Richard Hell, and
From the Voivoids, right?
Voidoids, and
Voidoids.
before that with television.
Yeah.
And he's the one who turned me on to CBGBs and said, come down and see my band, Television. And so that was my first experience there. So we had already been shooting a bunch of sort of more of the, things before that, but it wasn't really a film. It was just footage of Bowie and Queen and, New York Dolls, the glam rock scene, and then Blondie and then Patti Smith. And it was a half-hour movie called Night Lunch, but we couldn't distribute a half-hour movie, so we decided to make an hour movie to go with it. And we could put two movies together and be a feature-length film, Night Lunch and Blank Generation.
So you saw Bowie and Queen at CBGB's?
Not CBGB's, but other venues in New York.
Gotcha. But small venues, essentially.
Because CBGB's was just about to begin. Glam rock was fading, and punk was coming up. And it was Patti Smith and Television were the first bands at CBGB.
Yeah, the Ramones, right?
And then the Ramones came, and then Talking Heads came, and other bands came. And the thing for me, as a filmmaker, not as a musician, was that I was using a silent 16 millimeter camera to shoot bands, and people would say, what the hell are you doing? It's not going to be in sync if you put music to it. And I went, that's the whole point, not to be in sync. To be in sync is too easy. I believed that at the time that the audio track and the visual track should not always mesh. In fact, there should be tension between them where you could hear Patti Smith sing, but it wasn't lip sunk, right? And I believed that if you did that, you would get the audience to see better and hear better because it wasn't in sync. Because we're so used to sync.
Yeah.
What the hell? Sync is dime a dozen. Sync is for sissies. Let's just make it not sync, which was the version of punk in cinema to me.
That's awesome.
Right? So that was the thinking back then. And, because when you're young, your thinking is, you never question your thinking. This is it. This has got to be it.
Yeah.
But people would go, how's that going to work? And I go, watch how that's going to work. Now, Ivan and I did because I worked at New Line Cinema, which did midnight shows like Pink Flamingos and things like that. We put this film out there and started calling up, film places that we knew that would show Pink Flamingos or El Topo or something like that. And I say, hey, we got this new thing, this punk movie. You want to show it? There's like, Cleveland has like 1,000 punks running around. Come on, they'll all come and see it. So because they knew us a little bit, they go, all right, we'll show your film next weekend. Send us a print and da-da-da. So we'd call them on Monday to see how Friday, Saturday midnights went. And they go, well, 30 people came. Oh, 30 people? Oh, okay. What do we get, like $5 each? No. 30 people came, but 15 of them left and wanted their money back. They hated it. The out of sync thing was just blew their minds, and they like, fuck this, let me get out of here. So on one hand, especially Ivan was so pissed off, like, oh, you return money to these people? But for me, as a filmmaker, I thought, this is great. People hate the movie, and the other people stayed, obviously, so they must like it. We don't have anybody in the middle. People hate us or love it. There's nothing in the middle. And that's art right there.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Okay. So, the sort of, in my opinion at that time, which was a little arrogant, I must say, in retrospect, I thought, that's art. Either they hate it, they got to hate it, and some people get it. And you want the audience who gets it. You don't give a shit about the people who don't get it and leave them with their money back. They're out of your picture. You want the people, and you're building an audience for maybe a next film who see your work as like outside the box a little, right, or punk, whatever, but now are like, oh, this guy doesn't give a shit. He's just going to make his movie, and if it's out of sync, he's got a whole way of dealing with it. And a lot of people did respond and wrote us and said, we love that out of sync shit because the music was hearable, not in part of like some visual, but the visual was also like so out of focus or so black and white or so this or that, scratchy, and the lighting was weird, and they were getting the whole punk aesthetic in cinema rather than just the music part. So I felt, or myself, Ivan a little less so, but probably he also eventually felt that way, that Blank Generation was successful, whatever, because it was the first time we were actually getting paid from a movie theater for a film that we made. It was like a whole, oh my God, we don't have to have a job to pay our rent. Can we do this as a career, or not even career? The word career wasn't even in the picture, but it was like, can we do this and still stay alive?
Yeah.
I then got a job as a superintendent of a building on 15th Street in order not to pay rent, so I could save the rent money to make a feature film, and that became Unmade Beds.
Amazing. I'm Albanian by nationality. There's many Albanian supers in New York City.
Yeah, right. But this was like a weird building because it was brand new. It was like just renovated, 65 apartments. My whole thing, and I was renting them too for the owner. So my thing was, when I was renting the apartments, because it had just been renovated, so there was nobody living in it. And when I first moved, got the job, so he said, I'll give you another $50 if you rent them. I said, all right. So my thing with the renters was, look, I'm the super. My wife is helping me at the time being the super, but you'll never see us. Here's a list of plumbers, electricians, anything you need. We don't do anything. We put out the garbage. That's it. We'll clean the hallways. But don't call us if you got a light bulb or sink going or a toilet going, whatever. Here's the numbers. And if you're cool with that, then you can rent it. But if you're not, if you think you're going to need us, don't rent it. In fact, you'll maybe only see us around Christmas time when we want to get your cash. Right? And it was really funny because like almost everybody who moved into the building was like into it. Like, oh, okay, you guys are, why are you supers? you're not Albanian, right? Like, well, kind of. Like I'm trying to save money to make a movie. Oh, now when I made Unmade Beds, a lot of the quote unquote sets or apartments were empty apartments in my building.
Nice.
So I was able to get to an empty apartment and actually shoot a scene in there, dress it up and make it into a thing. But that was that period in New York.
Amazing.
You could do that kind of thing.
So I was born on West 14th Street. My parents at St. Vincent's Hospital, my parents were the superintendents of their building on West 14th Street.
Where? Well, between
by 8th Avenue.
Yeah, that's where we were. Between 7th and 8th. And
that's
15th.
so funny. And this was in 81 when I was born.
Yeah.
Were you there in those years?
By 81 I was gone. We were there from like 74 to 76. Right after I finished shooting Unmade Beds. In fact, I got fired from my superintendent job, and I got fired from my film distribution job, and I had no money. I just spent all the savings, and I just had a brand new baby.
Oh, wow.
And it was really dark. It was really hard that year, like 76 to 78, really.
And New York was rough back then.
It was rougher, that's for sure. It was not as gentrified, and it was still less expensive than it is now.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
people could come here and be artists still. It really, really changed by 1980, I would say, 83, 84. By that point, it was like, okay, the banks took over New York City, and it was going to be real estate hell. And because before you could, when I first moved to New York in 72, my first apartment was on St. Mark's and 2nd Avenue, and the rent was $72 a month. So
that's amazing.
So you could work part-time or whatever and still have time to make your art.
That doesn't even correlate with inflation.
No, I mean, that's, or inflation or how much people make.
Yeah.
No, everything changed. When New York went bankrupt in that period, in like 73, 74, 75, up until that point, every year they would have a budget. They would go to the banks, borrow the money to pay the police and the fire department and everything. And then from taxes, they would pay it back. But the taxes, people were moving out of the city by so much, and businesses weren't paying taxes. There were empty buildings all over the place. Like there was no real estate. State.
Yeah, I know people were even burning down their buildings just to collect insurance.
Right, because the insurance was more than the building was worth, or they could make from renting. So the banks decided the first time ever, we're not lending you any money because we don't believe you can pay back. And it was like, what's going to happen to New York City? So New York City appealed to the federal government, which was a famous Gerald Ford telling New York to screw off. So now the federal government was going to come and help us. New York couldn't subsist, and the banks made a deal. Okay, here's the deal. We'll give you the money, but we own you.
Wow.
You're going to do whatever we tell you to do. And the mayor at that point said, okay, I have to do this. Otherwise, we are going to go bankrupt. And as a city, New York can't go bankrupt. So the banks owned it. And then suddenly, that Alphabet City, you suddenly saw police on every corner. And suddenly, the whole area was getting cleaned up from drugs. And suddenly, the real estate values were going up. And real estate owned New York. To this day, real estate owns New York. Like a mayor can't stand up to the banks. So New York, essentially, was sold from the population of New York, the people who live in it, to the banks.
It's interesting to hear this history and perspective from you that's lived through it like that.
Yeah, it was a huge, giant shift. Because downtown for us, filmmakers and people that were making stuff there, was like perfect. It was like a playground.
There was such a thriving scene
Yeah.
that sort of cultivated punk and
Yeah, you could come in, and if you were a painter or a sculptor, you could get a loft and pay, $300-$200
Yeah.
for a giant, whole floor.
Did you know Basquiat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It was like everybody knew each other back then.
Yeah, because that was the other thing. There wasn't an internet or cell phones or any of that stuff, smartphones. But somehow the same 300-400 people ended up every night at the same place.
Yeah.
Whether it was the Mud Club or CBGB's or, One University, Mickey's, or Max's Kansas City or whatever. People moved in these. And how did you know about it? You walked down the street and you ran into somebody and they said, hey, tonight, this is happening. So you go, oh, yeah, okay, I'll go there. Or you would tell somebody else, hey, I just heard a walking thing. I mean, Jean-Michel, I met him initially at CBGB's, where he came up to me one day and he just said, you got to change your name. I go, why? He goes, because I have the same name in different way of spelling it. Mine is Samo and yours is Amos. You can't have the same letters as me. I was like, oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Was he sort of fucking around? Or was
he was playing.
Yeah.
But it was by way of introduction.
Yeah.
And later on when I directed a TV party with Glenn O'Brien, Jean-Michel would come around and hang out in the booth with me. And then we had a scene in downtown 81 together. And then he became my neighbor because I lived on Great Jones, between Bowery and Lafayette. He took over Andy Warhol's place on Great Jones. And that was actually when I got closest to him in those last years before he died, because he was my neighbor.
Yeah.
And he would always fuck with me. He would always go, he would see me on the street and he goes, hey, how you doing? And I go, I don't know, I'm broke again. And he goes, oh, you need some money? I go, yeah, you got $20? And he'd open his pocket and he'd pull out this wad of $100 bills. And he'd look through the $100 bills. He goes, yeah, I don't have a 20. Put it back in his pocket.
Oh, man, that is...
and then I'd look at him and he'd go, oh, wait, hold on. And he'd pull out 100 and he goes, here, take this and just, pay me back whenever. So then, he'd ring my bell. And, sometimes my wife would look out the window and go, what do you want, Jean-Michel? Well, Amos owes me $20. Is he there? She goes, honey, Jean-Michel's downstairs. So I buzz him up and he come up and he goes, hey, you got the $20 I lent you? I go, that was 100. I don't think so. I think it was 20. I think you owe him 20. So I'd always have to pay him 20 for the 100.
That's a good deal.
But it was a way of him telling me, I'm successful and you're not.
Oh, you think that's what he was doing?
But he also loved that idea that I was building a family, and he had a hard time even, relating in a relationship to anyone.
Yeah.
And I was out of drugs at that point. He was still into drugs, and I was like, dude, you gotta stop
calm
this
down.
stuff. It's gonna kill you. And literally in 1988, on a Friday afternoon, right across from his house was a garage that did only European cars or something. And I had this old Mercedes that was always messed up. And I went to get my car with my son, who was a year and a half at that point. I think it was the 18th of August. I went to get my car. It was still on the lift. They were about to bring it down. And I turned around and I saw Jean-Michel's door was open. And I was like, Jean-Michel never leaves his door open. He's so paranoid. What the hell? Hey, Nick, let's go see what's going on with Jean-Michel. And we walked in. He was dead.
Oh, my God.
And his girlfriend had just gotten there, Kelly, and just called 911. And, he was lying there with blood coming out of his nose. And
wow.
She was crying. And because my son was so little, I didn't want him to see that, So we walked out, and my car came down, and we got in the car and picked up my wife, and we were driving out to Long Island. And it was like, holy cow. That was something I had not anticipated, that he would die. But he was, so despairing because Warhol had died the year before, and he and his whole relationship to Warhol had gotten so sour after their shows together.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I think he just gave up. I think he didn't have the sort of positive energy to overcome, the inertia, the gravity of drugs.
This is wild because I had no idea that you even, I was just like, oh, everybody knew each other. I didn't know that you knew him this well I mentioned it.
I mean,
Yeah.
I knew him, sporadically, or we were hanging out in the same circles.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until we were neighbors the last 4 years, that I really got to know him better because we would see each other on the block.
Yeah.
And he really liked my son. When he was little, he whenever we went to Jean Michel's, he'd give him a crayon, and my son would just draw some crazy shit, and Jean Michel would love it. He'd go, "Oh my God, that is really good. Your kid's got talent." I go, "What do you mean? He's just this little kid with a crayon." "Yeah, but look at the way he did that yellow and that blue." He realized that you put them together, they become green, and then he started doing all together, and half of this drawing is green. I was like, "Oh, I didn't notice that."
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
He had a good heart, it sounded like.
Yeah, he liked kids. I think he would have, had he survived that period and somehow gotten himself straight, he would have had a different life, different career.
Yeah.
Sad.
Very. This is a story you might appreciate because you were talking about the out of sync thing. In sort of preparation for this podcast, I was watching simultaneously last night your film, The Foreigner, and then also The Blank Generation. At sometimes I had them on two monitors side by side in my office at my house.
Right.
And sometimes I would just have the subtitles on for The Foreigner, and then I was just listening to the music, the sound of The Blank Generation. Then sometimes I would turn the volume down on that, and
that's interesting.
and I was like, "There's such a cohesion
Mashup.
Yeah, but there's a cohesion to your work, that I think is pretty cool." I know you're also friends with Jim Jarmusch, right? And were you? How did you guys meet? Just from the downtown New York filmmaking
We
scene?
met. There was a guy, I can't remember his name now, a teacher at NYU who had seen Unmade Beds. He asked me to come to his class and show it to his class, it was a grad school at NYU, and I said, sure. I think I was paid an honorarium of $40 or something. And so I went to screen it, and in that class was Jim and Sarah Driver and Spike Lee. And I showed the film, and they all kind of looked at it. Okay, what's that? And I hadn't gone to film school, which was always like a chip on my shoulder in a way, because I felt like I was a filmmaker, but I didn't know how to be a director. There was a difference between people who went to film school who had more of an academic education about film than what I was, which was just picking stuff up on my own, like an autodidact. And then Sarah and Jim, who ended up, they have had a long relationship now since the mid-'70s. They were really into Unmade Beds, and then I think Jim said, how much did that film cost? And I said, I don't know, $3,000. I go, how much does NYU cost? And he went $3,000 a semester. I go, well, you should just leave school and make a film. And he did. He made a Permanent Vacation. But we've been friends ever since then. And I love Jim. I'm really fond and appreciative of the depth and length of his filmmaking.
Yeah, he's made an eclectic
Yes.
amount of film, a bunch of films, and pretty eclectic.
Eclectic, and as you were saying before, that there's a through line.
There is, for sure.
That goes through them, and that's the sort of, partly it's Jim's attitude, and partly the sort of poetry of the way he perceives the universe, you know.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah. I like his movie, the number of his films, but I really like Night on Earth.
That one, I like Down by Law.
Down by Law is great as well.
I like Ghost Dog. I like Dead Man. I like Patterson.
Broken Flowers is my
Broken
favorite.
Flowers,
I loved it.
That one, I don't know. It didn't grab me as much as I thought it was going to. But yeah. No, it's kind of funny because I think when you're watching Jim's films, it depends a large part on where your head is at. So I think you can appreciate probably all of them if your head was in the right place. So
That makes sense.
there's a poetry to it, and it's kind of universal. It's not like American, like his films translate well all around the world.
Oh yeah, he's huge in France, right?
He's huge in France and Japan and, you know, Italy. And
It's funny. It's funny how like I've noticed that in general because, like I told you, I used to go to hardcore shows and things like that. And what could CBGBs hold? Like 300 people, you know?
Yeah.
Something like that. At least that was the official capacity.
Right.
I've definitely been there where they're putting
more.
twice as many people. But but one time I was in Berlin. This is like maybe 15 years ago or so. And I saw there were a couple of bands playing. And there was a poster for these bands in like the subway station in Berlin. And it was like Madball and Sick of It All, these New York hardcore bands.
Oh, really?
And then I went and I looked it up. I had to go to an internet. This is like before smartphones. So I had to go to an internet cafe at the time to find out where that venue was. And it turned out it was a place near where I was staying. And I went over there and there were thousands of people there. And these bands were from New York.
Right.
But there were thousands of people in Berlin coming out to see them.
Berlin has always been a great venue for New York bands or movies. My films played more of the Berlin Film Festival and became European, so not hits, but, you know.
Yeah. Did you go out there and stuff?
Yeah, I loved Berlin before the wall came down. To me, Berlin was the time for Berlin. Once the wall came down, like 88, 89, whatever, 89, I think, it changed a lot, and it's still a great city, you know, but before the wall came down, it was wild because you had to fly over East Germany, you know, to get there. And it was an island, like this weird island in the middle of a country, Berlin. And just getting there was just incredible.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and nobody wanted to live there. So the government was basically, the West German government was paying people to live in Berlin because what are you going to do in Berlin? There's no industry. There's nothing to, you know. So artists went there, and the whole city seemed like a bunch of artists because the government was paying you to live there. East Berlin was communist and part of East Germany, which you were in the middle of East Germany. So Berlin was in the middle of East Germany.
Yeah.
So you had to, you couldn't even fly a German airline into Berlin. What do you call it?
Lufthansa.
Lufthansa. You had to go. You flew to Munich or Frankfurt or Hamburg. Then you had to take either Pan Am or British Airways or Air France, the three other places that were part of West Berlin, and because they wouldn't let a West German airline fly over East Germany, so you had to change planes and then fly to Berlin. Berlin was just like a whole other animal before the wall came down.
One thing I also wanted to mention is you've had a number of people that you've directed in your films. You directed Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Yeah, in his first film.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. How was it like working with him?
Oh, I love Phil.
He was such a great actor.
I wanted to work with him again, and unfortunately, he passed away.
Yeah.
You know, another drug casualty in a sense. I have a friend who was this woman, Davy Littlefield, who is a manager, and one day she called me. She goes, "I want to be downtown. I'm going to this little venue to see these like actors do this like one act thing. I'm thinking of signing this guy named Phil Hoffman, you want to come with me? And I was just about to do a film called Triple Bogey on a Par 5 Hole, this little indie film. And it was like 1990, I believe. So I went with Davey, and what it was that these actors wrote their own little skits. It was like 15 minutes, and it was all about racism. And Phil did this thing on this little stage. There was like 15, 20 people in the whole place. And he did it with this actress. And the scene was, they were just coming out of a movie, an Eddie Murphy movie. They come out of the movie, and Phil says to the girl, to this woman, how'd you like the movie? And she goes, oh man, that's great. I love that movie. It's so funny. I love Eddie Murphy. And he goes, you love Eddie Murphy? She goes, yeah, he's greatest. I love him. You mean you like Eddie Murphy? Or he's funny, or you love Eddie Murphy? And she's like, well, I like Eddie Murphy. I've seen all his films. I guess I like him, love him, But you love Eddie Murphy. Well, he's great, right? He's so funny. You love Eddie Murphy? How do you love Eddie Murphy? What's your problem? Well, you love him. You mean you love this black man, right? Because he's got a big dick, right? And she's like, what? What are you talking about? And he starts ragging on her, and he gets so intense that you're sitting in the audience and you were scared for the girl. And you go, oh my God, he just turned this scene. It's like Joe Pesci in Goodfellas.
In Goodfellas, that's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, he's going to murder her.
Yeah.
He's going to kill her. And the actress who was really also very good, but you could feel her being scared.
Yeah.
And you could feel intensity and ferociousness of this actor, this young actor. And then when it was done, it was like, whew, oh my God, okay, I got to get out of here. I got to go get some air outside. And then we went outside, and Davian came out, and I said, you better sign that guy. That guy is good. He's amazing. And she goes, yeah, I think I'm going to sign him.
He certainly had the chops.
And she signed him.
I think that Sidney Lumet movie, Before the Devil Knows You're Dead,
oh my God,
that was so good.
Yeah, and it was like, I think, Sidney's last movie. And
yeah, that was Sidney last, yeah.
I'm not sure if it was Phil's. I don't know. I think
No,
he did.
I think he had it. But it was, that one came out in 2006, but that was Lumet's last movie.
Yeah, it was. He's so good in so many movies. Paul Thomas Anderson's movies.
Hard Eight. He had like a cameo in Hard Eight.
Yeah.
But then the movie The Master was incredible. And there's a scene with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Joaquin Phoenix where they're like down in like the hull of the ship or whatever, and they're like drinking this hooch, and it's like there's some homemade alcohol, and I was like, man, this is some of the best acting I've ever seen on camera.
Yeah, Phil was natural. He studied. He went to NYU. He was, well educated in acting, but he was also natural, just a natural talent. In my opinion, he was one of the 3 or 4 best actors of his generation.
Absolutely, no question. Joaquin Phoenix is amazing as well.
Yep, and Daniel Day-Lewis.
Oh yeah, he's unbelievable. Did you see Phantom Thread?
Yes.
Yeah,
I loved that.
I loved it. You also directed Debbie Harry. She's
Yep.
been in your early work. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, Debbie was, amazing. She was like a superstar. I mean, there were so many amazing people at that time. That's, I think, what made it really happen. It was, Debbie and Chris Stein and, David Byrne, Patti Smith, Richard Howell. I mean, there were such an amazing group of people at the same time in the same place. You couldn't help but make it like amazing.
Yeah, there was a real thing in New York, and this ties into something that I feel about movies in general. And kind of as I progress as a filmmaker, one thing that I notice and that's important to me is I think when when there's films that I really respond to, there's sort of a vibe in that film, and your work has a vibe to it, you know, and it's almost like it could even be shown as artwork. Like if somebody was having a party, your work could be shown, you know, like it could just be there, and you know, it adds to the vibe of the party or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a film I made in 2006, 2005, 2006, 7 called Empire 2, which was a kind of a reimagining of Andy Warhol's Empire.
Yeah, I've seen some clips from it.
Yeah, like a digital version of Empire. And that one is literally like wallpaper. You could, like, any music goes with it. But that was a digital experimental film.
When you look back at your body of work, is there a particular film that you're the most proud of?
I think The Foreigner, in a way, may be the most coherent and strange, you know, film that I've made.
I love the scene where he's sitting in the hotel room, and then there's that little documentary about punk rock playing, that like news section, and you're just watching it and watching this guy watch that in real time. It was a bold choice.
Well, it was an accident.
I loved it personally.
We were in a Chelsea hotel, and we were going to do this one little scene, and then somebody said, "Hey, you know, they're doing this thing on, I don't know what it was, Dateline or 60 Minutes or whatever it was. It was like about punk in London." I go, "Hey, turn on the TV and let's look at it." And then our DP, Shireen, said, "Let's film it." I go, "Yeah, let's film it." So Eric was like watching that. Yeah, that film has a lot of, in a lot of ways, the most positive, even though there was a lot of negative stuff going on around it, it really changed things. More so in retrospect than when I was there at the time. But it was a really difficult time in my life, and it was a really great collaboration with Eric and everybody else who was on the film. And it was just a sprint to make that film. It was just invention after invention after invention. And the final invention of that film was that at the very end of making that film, I was like literally broke again and had no money for a sound mix. And I was like sitting there going, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I got to mix the sound, but I got no money for a sound mix. And even like somebody said, I'll do it for $400. I was like, yeah, but
you don't even have the 400.
Yeah. And then what happened was I somehow miraculously happened to watch it again without the sound mix, where it was like literally one track just butt spliced. I wasn't even separated into different tracks.
Yeah.
It was just one track. So if there was music, there was no dialogue.
Oh, so that's why the music cuts off. Actually, I kind of liked it. I thought that was an artistic choice.
Well, it became one.
I liked it.
But
I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Actually, the music just will cut off from a scene and just.
But it came from like going, okay, I don't have the money for a mix. Then I listened to it, watched it and listened to it, and I went, does a film always need a mix? Does sound always have to like fade in and fade out and be perfectly like, can't it just be boom, 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 boom? And I went, what if you did a whole feature with boom, like with butt spliced,
Yeah.
Like the volumes are different and everything is like different tones, room tones and whatever. What if you had no mix at all? And I asked a few people, and they were like, yeah, I don't think that will work. I go, you don't? Why? Well, it's not how your ears work. Your ears need to be, I go, well, is every visual a fade in and a fade out? Or, are you always like dissolving in between shots? No, you're hard cutting. What if you do that with sound, though? The more I thought about it, the more I said, you know what? Let's make it. The film is done. We're going to screen it next week. And we screened it the following week, and it was like like everybody in town came to see it, and it was great. But it was because my belief was partly that they never heard a movie like this before.
Yeah, it was
You never heard a movie where every cut is butt spliced without any modulation or tonal shit. It was rough all the way through, and I think that was part of its strangeness or uniqueness. I remember like becoming very conscious afterwards, like especially when we screened it in Deauville and in Berlin and other film festivals, how every film had a sound mix. And I would ask people, like, because when we showed it in Deauville, it was the year that David Lynch showed Eraserhead. So I said to Lynch, do you have sound mix on your film? He goes, oh yeah, what do you mean? Of course. I have like 8 tracks on some of these.
Yeah, Eraserhead actually has a pretty elaborate sound design.
Yeah. Talk to Robert Altman. Of course you got to have a sound mix. Talk to Scorsese. Hey, what are you talking about? You don't mix your sound? I go, I'm just wondering. And it's like, oh, wow. We're onto something here. Nobody's doing this shit.
Yeah.
Let's do it. And we did.
Speaking of Scorsese, because you made a lot of your films after Taxi Driver. Was Taxi Driver...
Oh, yeah.
That must have been amazing seeing that in the theater.
Taxi Driver, I actually saw them film a couple of scenes because I was working around Columbus Circle in that thing where he goes to, he's shaved his mohawk, and he comes in and it was De Niro. Like, oh, wow. Yeah, no, I loved it. Taxi Driver was like, I thought Schrader's script, the whole thing. But for Taxi Driver, when I saw it, I was like blown away by the music.
Oh, yeah. The Bernard Herrmann score is incredible.
It's incredible.
That was his last score, I think.
Yes, it was the last score. He died like a day after he delivered it.
Yeah, wow.
And that's why Scorsese dedicates the first credit at the end is for Bernard Herrmann.
Right, that's right.
Because if you really look at it without the music, the film is very choppy. And Scorsese talks about it. He said that when he had made the film, he had just become friends with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, and he wanted the Rolling Stones to do the soundtrack. And he had screened it for Brian De Palma, a rough cut. Like he had cut the picture, but there was no, music yet. And De Palma said, Marty, this film doesn't work. It's just choppy and fucked up. I mean, it's great scenes, but like nothing holds it together. It's just falling apart. And he says, yeah, but I got the Rolling Stones to make the soundtrack. It's going to be really rock and roll. And Brian De Palma looked at him and said, are you out of your mind, Marty? Rolling Stones? Get the fuck out of here. They're like a rock and roll. How could they do music for a movie? You're like, what are you talking about? You might like the band, but no, get a real composer. Get somebody real, like, I don't know, like Bernard Herrmann. And Marty said, wait, is he still alive? He goes, yeah, he's still alive. He did music for my film, Call him up. He's in London. Here's his number. Scorsese thinks about it for a minute, and he's like, yeah, maybe Brian is right. Like, I should get a real composer, right? And he talks to the producers, and they go, yeah, get a real, if you can get Bernard Herrmann, what the fuck? Get Bernard Herrmann, Rolling Stones. Give me a break. So he called him, and he said, yeah, I'm available. Nobody's calling me. I'm old. And Scorsese says, well, I'll send you. So he sends him the thing. Herrmann looks at the film. Scorsese calls him and goes, well, what do you think? He goes, oh, yeah, no, I got some good ideas. I think I know. Yeah. So he calls him next week. How's it going? Oh, it's going really great. I think I've got the main theme. I'm getting the London Philharmonic. So Scorsese says, how would you describe it if you could describe it in words? And he goes, oh, it's very romantic. Scorsese flips out. He goes, romantic? It's a violent. Oh, no, it's a love story. Scorsese, oh, shit, I got the wrong guy. Like, it's a love story. What do you mean? And he goes, calls him back, and a couple days later he goes, how's it going? He goes, it's almost done. I'll send it to you in a couple of days. What do you mean by romantic? He goes, it's a love story. I told you. love story. Like, what love story? He says, it's a love story between you and New York City.
Yes.
And then he threw Scorsese off track when he said that. And then the score was done. It was sent to New York. Thelma Schoonmaker got it, and Scorsese, how's it working? And she goes, holy shit.
Yeah.
That's what we needed.
It's one of the best pairings of sound and picture of all time.
I think so too. And she put it together, and the next morning they had a screening, and Scorsese says, you went into the screening being very, very nervous, very anxious, that he had no idea how romantic, like, what is Bernard Herrmann talking about? Like, he expected, like, something, and then Bernard Herrmann, right, and that great opening.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I personally don't like things that are too on the nose. Like, Law and Order, if you watch Law and Order, it's like, here's a suspenseful scene.
Yeah.
Here's suspenseful music.
Yeah.
Like,
and anything Law and Order, don't even go there. but the fact that, and Scorsese says he sat there and he saw the film completely differently because he had been so involved in the film, he thought he knew the movie. He said once Bernard Herrmann's score went on, it was like a whole different experience. And he was speechless for like 15 minutes afterwards. And then finally, Thelma looked at him and goes, Marty, can you say something? Can you open your mouth? And he went, oh my God, this is amazing. And then he told Brian De Palma, he called Brian De Palma, he said, thanks, the guy, he changed the whole movie. I mean, it's like his input into this movie made the movie, you're right, it holds it all together now. Whereas before it was like this disparate scenes, right? And De Palma said to him, that's great, you should call him and thank him. And he called him and he was dead.
Wow.
He had just died.
But what a legacy he left. And also your story, first of all, incredible story. And that's also a testament to the true collaborative nature of the medium of film, which is something that personally drew me into this field.
So most directors, filmmakers, they have a sense of music, they have a sense of tone and all that stuff. But if you have a really great composer like Bernard Herrmann, don't give him directions.
Yeah.
Do not direct. It's kind of trying to direct Phil Hoffman or Daniel Day-Lewis or, like just chill. Let them do their thing. And, if you need to tweak it, you tweak it later. But like, if you got somebody like that, you're working with someone who's got real chops in their field, just let them just say, here, I don't know. I mean, I have ideas, but my ideas, don't worry about them. Because you can't describe sound with words. You can't say, well, I think I want it romantic, or I think I want it violent, or I think you should have violins, or I think you should have harmonica. Because I always have those ideas, but it was like, if you have a composer, just let them run with it.
I think it was Stanley Kubrick that said, cinema is closer to music than it is to any other medium.
Yeah, because if you have to explain it, it's like you have to feel it.
Yes, exactly. That's why I don't understand when people say, oh, I read about that movie, I don't really need to watch it. I'm like, well, if you read about a fucking good meal, does that mean you don't need to eat it? It's such a strange sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very much like that. It's like, it's like cooking. Like, you need the right ingredients, or you need fresh vegetables, or you need something.
But you could only know it by experiencing the meal. Exactly. You could read about it to maybe entice you to want to eat that or not, but you can only fully know it by, experiencing it. Yeah. And I feel like the same thing is true for a film.
Yeah.
So I think this will be a good time to segue into our second portion of the podcast, which is I ask each guest for 2 of their favorite movie scenes from any films of all time. It doesn't have to be the most absolute favorite, I always say, but just 2 scenes that you like or appreciate.
There's so many good examples of it, but for me, one of them is the opening of Once Upon a Time in the West. Sergio Leone.
I love it. Yeah.
that
with Peter Fonda and Charles Bronson.
Henry Fonda.
Henry Fonda. That's what I meant to say. Henry Fonda.
Yeah.
Peter Fonda's dad.
Yeah. Jane Fonda's dad. That opening in the train station when they're waiting for the guy to come, and it's like the longest stretching of time. It's so beautifully done. Just these three guys going to kill this guy.
That's also a good example of the score. There's Sergio Leone worked with Ennio Morricone, and just the sounds, the ambient sounds of kind of what's going on, tying into the score of the film is incredible.
The fly and
it's so good. That's such a good opening sequence.
Yeah, that sequence to me is like a perfect, like how to open an epic film, like stretched time. The whole idea of waiting for a train. Everybody's waited for a train. So everybody has an idea of what that is. But who are these guys? And why are they waiting? And what are they going to do when the train arrives? And the whole ambiance of this train station, the production design, the sound design, the whole thing. And you're just kind of like, I'm just going to watch that 10 times.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, and talk about a vibe. Like that movie is.
Yeah, it sets it all thing up, and then the first lines are like, "There's 3 horses there," and he says, "It looks like you're 1 horse shy," and they said, "No, we're not," and then they have the gunfight, and he kills all 3. You kind of know, holy shit, this is a good badass. This guy's so bad.
And people, from what I read about, people weren't used to seeing Henry Fonda as a villain.
Yes. Henry Fonda was such a, sort of Tom Hanks. It's like seeing Tom Hanks as a villain. Yeah, it was great casting, obviously, and Claudia Cardinal later on and everything. It's a stupendous film. The other one that is also kind of opening is the first 20 minutes or so of There Will Be Blood. That there's no dialogue. Like the guy goes down the well and he's like falls and the whole Daniel Day-Lewis just there's no the lack of dialogue in that first 20 minutes, like not a single line of dialogue is so beautiful.
It's incredibly cinematic.
Yeah. And so you actually have to be conscious when you're writing a script. There's going to be a part in this film that I'm going to tell it only through pictures, and there's not going to be any dialogue. Now, it's easier to do if there's one character. It's harder to do if there's 2, because 2 people are going to talk.
Yeah.
But what if they don't? Even harder if there's 3. Much harder to do a scene with 3 people and no dialogue. Like, why are they not talking to each other? Right? And like if you, as a screenwriter, if you set that up as a kind of a challenge, or as Lars von Trier would say, as an obstruction, you can really get to creating a sequence or a scene that really kind of makes your movie come alive.
I think that's so important that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is just those kind of obstructions and how they actually foster creativity.
Right. So one is a writer, like, can you write a scene or sequence of scenes, like a block? How long can you go without dialogue? And how much tension does that build? Because the audience is so ready for, like, when are they going to talk? It's the same thing like if you introduce a character and the camera's behind them, you don't see their face for the first 5 minutes.
Yes.
It's like creates a tension because you don't want to give them what they want. You want them to want it before you give it to them. You want to create the need to see.
I had that in my opening scene of my feature film, The Trouble, that introduces the main characters because they're in a bar and you just see the backs of them. And my producer, George, who's a great guy, but But he was like, why do we just see the backs of them for so long? I'm like, I want it to feel like somebody's there eavesdropping on these guys' conversations for a while before we then cut
It's
into
like
close
how
up.
long can you go before you see their faces?
Yeah.
Because you're creating what the producer's actually saying to you is, I want to see their faces, and you go, and you're frustrating me because you're not showing me their faces, and you kind of go, oh, I've accomplished the task of a director.
Yes.
I've created the need to see prior to seeing. Same thing with like dialogue. I've created a need to hear this person talk or say something. Now later on in There Will Be Blood, he has long monologues.
Yeah.
He has lots of conversations that are great. But like the fact that you are seeing his physicality, and for an actor like Daniel Day-Lewis, who's so physical anyway, he's so wonderfully physical. He's great in Phantom Thread when he's talking, obviously, or what was the film with Scorsese and Michelle Pfeiffer? That one was great.
The Age of Innocence?
Yeah, Age of Innocence. He's so voluble in terms of speaking, but he's also such a physical actor. You want to be able to like mine that part of his aura.
I know it's a frequently referenced scene in There Will Be Blood, but the scene where he's in the church and Paul Dano's character is like, it's like, I've abandoned my child. And at first he's just sort of going with it, but, and then he just loses it. He's like, I've abandoned my boy. I've abandoned my child. He's just tearing it up.
Yeah, he works the script really well. I mean, he's the kind of actor, and Phil was like that too. I think he could break down a scene. I remember when Phil did Doubt with Meryl Streep, and they were kind of antagonistic characters, and she would mess him up all the time during shooting, and he was so scared of her. Phil was not intimidated by any actors really, as far as I could tell, or people, if I had a conversation with Phil about, hey, what was it like working with so-and-so? He was never really intimidated, like, oh, this guy's great. But with Meryl Streep, he was like, I'm ready to kill her. Because he would do like a scene with her, and he would have nailed it. And what's his name, the guy who wrote it, the playwright, he would say, hey, Phil, that was great. And then they would all look at Meryl, and she would look at Phil like with this cross-eyed look, and she would say, I think you'll want to do another.
Wow.
And so she was casting doubt on his acting, and the film is called Doubt. And Phil never had doubt about his acting. I mean, he had maybe doubt about his life, but not about his acting, because he knew when he nailed it.
The writer and director is named John Patrick Shanley.
Shanley, yeah. John Patrick Shanley. It was great.
It was based off a true story, if I'm not mistaken.
It might, yeah, I don't remember. But I remember when he was filming it in New York, and he was like, oh, I should have taken that film out in Wyoming. Oh, man.
So you guys kept in touch. You guys were...
We would occasionally, because I lived around the corner for a while from his office. So we would run into each other at this coffee shop, like that was like equidistant from our place.
Yeah.
Or, once in a while we'd just run each other somewhere at a screening or somewhere else. But I didn't keep in touch with him as much as I should have wanted to, really.
Yeah.
Because he was also so busy. His career just
ascended, yeah.
Everybody wanted to work with him.
Yeah.
And he was getting, he'd get like 10 scripts a week.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And he had choices. He could do another Paul Thomas Anderson, or he could do, Sidney Lumet, or he could do, there was people who got what he was bringing to the table. Everybody wanted to work with him. Why not? Why wouldn't you want to work with him?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I thought what he did with Capote was incredible. He just owned it. You look at that movie and you go, I don't think anybody else could do that.
Yeah.
Nobody else could play Capote. And he kind of Yeah, he had a range that was really, really, really strong.
Absolutely. So, Amos, before we conclude the podcast, is there any other thoughts that you wanted to share or?
Not really. I mean, I think we've covered a wide range.
I think so
Hopefully.
too. I'm so grateful for you being on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. Glad
All
to be
right.
here.
Thank you for listening to the Film Situation Podcast.